absolutely, I say it, and sometimes people smile, and sometimes they say, great idea, but Canada, their taxes would come down greatly, their security would go up greatly. Amazing things happen to Canada, and really Canada in this particular, why would we pay $200 billion a year in subsidies to Canada when they're not a state? You do that for a state, but you don't do that for somebody else's country. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
U.S. President Donald Trump today talking tariffs again. Now, he was talking about reciprocal tariffs across the globe, but unprompted, as you heard there, he took aim at Canada yet again. That's despite the fact that this latest tariff announcement takes aim at countries that the U.S. doesn't have a free trade agreement with. So how will our government respond? Well, Anita Anand is Canada's Minister of Transport and Minister of Internal Trade. Welcome back to Power Play, Minister. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So just this afternoon, U.S. President Donald Trump said in the Oval Office today, when he's speaking about trade with Canada, he said, quote, "We don't need their products." Then he continued to say that Canada is going to be a very serious contender to become the 51st state, adding their taxes would come down greatly and their security would come up greatly. Federal officials have already said on a number of occasions, this is a non-starter. But how do you tell Canadians not to worry about our sovereignty if President Trump keeps talking about it?
Canada will never become the 51st state. Canada is a sovereign, free, and strong country, and that will be the case now and forever, period. Let me just say, there is a very strong case to be made that the U.S. supply chains are closely integrated with Canadian supply chains. Let's take steel and aluminum. Canadian exports of steel are about $8 billion US. Canadian exports of aluminum are about $11 billion US. Those numbers are large. So any tariff on steel and aluminum is going to negatively impact U.S. and Canadian workers, U.S. and Canadian families, U.S. and Canadian businesses. That is for sure. And that is a case that we are continuing to make to the U.S. administration. Our reaction will be firm, it will be clear, and you will continue to see Canada stand up for our sovereignty, our industry, our workers, and our businesses.
And I understand that argument. I wonder how it's being received, though, because we did have Dominic LeBlanc and we had Kirsten Hillman, the U.S. ambassador, the Canadian ambassador to the U.S., yesterday meet with Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce nominee. In your conversations with Dominic LeBlanc, how have you heard that those meetings in Washington went? Should Canadians feel better or worse about our situation based on the conversations in D.C.?
Canada and the U.S. have the most successful trading partnership in the world. And the conversations between our country and the United States administration have continued to stress that very point, as have the premiers when they were in Washington recently this week. But make no mistake, we need to diversify our supply chains so that we are not reliant to the tune of 80% on the U.S. economy. That means opening up supply chains to the Indo-Pacific. We are the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. We need to leverage our natural resources and our raw materials so that we can take advantage of those free trade agreements. And then finally, Mike, I'll say on internal barriers to trade, we need to eliminate those. They need to come down so that we can add up to $200 billion to the Canadian economy. We need free trade in our own country, one Canadian economy, not 13, so that we can continue to grow our domestic economy without going through Donald Trump at all.
Yeah, and I will come back to that internal trade in just a moment, but also U.S. President Trump spoke about these non-tariff barriers that some countries have, and he spoke about unfair subsidies that are involved in that. Do you think the president is targeting Canada's supply-managed industries like dairy or poultry, or is he also trying to address the issues that they have with our country on softwood lumber? Do you think that that's what the play is with this latest sort of reciprocal tariffs that he's talking about today and the non-monetary tariffs that he's talking about as well?
Look, each and every one of these issues was part of the renegotiated NAFTA 2.0 that President Trump himself signed in 2017, and that is up for renegotiation in 2026. And we look forward to going to the table with the U.S. administration to negotiate the points that they are making in the various approaches that you mentioned. But make no mistake, Canada, as a sovereign country, will always stand up for Canadian businesses and Canadian workers and the Canadian agricultural sector as well.
Do you think it's worth renegotiating that earlier? And I say that because a number of premiers came away from that meeting in D.C. with that idea to say that maybe we should start those negotiations on CUSMA sooner than 2026.
We are very open to having that conversation as early as the Trump administration would like. As I said, the world's most successful trading relationship is based on agreements over successive years, and the renegotiation of this free trade agreement between our two countries is one of the most important items on our agenda.
You mentioned those interprovincial trade barriers. Last week you said that they could come down within 30 days. I wonder how that's possible, considering the barriers remain in place despite the Canadian Free Trade Agreement coming into force nearly 8 years ago. So how do you make something happen in 30 days that hasn't happened in the last 8 years?
It's a fair question. I have been at the table with each province and territory, and I have heard their enthusiasm and commitment to collaboration on reducing internal barriers to trade. For the federal government's part, we are working hard on reducing the exemptions in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement in areas like procurement, Mike, as well as financial services, where you see duplication. So you are going to see the federal government come out very strongly in terms of reducing barriers to trade from our perspective, and I expect that you are going to see the same from the provinces and territories. We're all on the same page. We need to have one Canadian economy, not 13 separate economies in this country.
When you say quickly, how quickly? Because I know a reporter had sort of pressed you on this last week and said within 30 days. Are you looking to do this sooner than 30 days to make sure that we can address this before any of those tariffs from the U.S. come into place?
We are looking at a three-staged process, looking first at those exemptions in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, reducing those significantly. Secondly, establishing mutual recognition across the country like we have in the trucking sector, so that businesses don't have to comply with 13 separate sets of rules when they simply want to raise revenue or hire more workers. And then thirdly, labor mobility. We need to make sure that workers, construction workers, nurses, doctors, lawyers, engineers are able to practice and work anywhere in this country without having to get permits every time they go to a new jurisdiction. And so those are the stages of this analysis, and the work is going well. The collaboration is strong, and Canadians, Canadian provinces, Canadian workers and businesses are committed to this process. We need to make sure that the Canadian economy is standing strongly, and the way to do that is to eliminate barriers to trade.
One of the things we always bring up when we talk about interprovincial trade is energy. Quebec Premier François Legault said he needs social acceptability on a project that would possibly bring energy from the west to the east, some sort of a pipeline. Do you think that there's more openness now from Quebecers to have this type of a thing go through their province, given where we are in terms of trade with the United States?
I have never seen the level of collaboration before that I am seeing now. And the reality is that we are open to continuing to see what we can do as a country to reduce the barriers to trade, to ensure that goods flow more easily from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In terms of that specific example that you are citing, there is that willingness to have the conversation. It is not part of the exercise that I'm engaged with the provinces and territories on.
But this is something that the federal government would want to push forward?
I think that we have to focus on what is immediately within our grasp. And immediately within our grasp is to build the Canadian economy by diversifying our own supply chains, by ensuring that the United States is aware of how integrated our supply chains are with them, and by reducing those internal barriers to trade. In terms of large infrastructure projects, you have seen that the federal government is committed to infrastructure generally. Let's look at the Trans Mountain Pipeline that we successfully built and that is working and flowing oil through. So let's make sure that we're having that conversation with the provinces and territories in terms of the short-term and long-term projects.
One last question before I let you go. In that briefing, when you were speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, Donald Trump was asked about readmitting Russia into the G7. As the former Minister of Defense and someone who had made a number of visits not only to NATO but also to Ukraine, how do you feel about that, having Russia come back into the G7 and make it a G8 again?
Well, let's be clear. Russia is not a member of the G7 now. Russia is not invited to the G7 meeting in Alberta in June. And the decisions about who is and who is not a member of the G7 is made by the G7 collectively.
What do you think it would do, though, if that was even brought up, as it seems like Donald Trump may want to have those discussions?
I think that is the conversation that the G7 leaders should have around the table. But as I said, Russia is not invited to the G7 meeting this year in Canada. Canada will be proudly representing this country and the beautiful province of Alberta when it welcomes the members of the G7 in June.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Minister of Transport and Internal Trade, Anita Anand, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Take care.